Ladies and gentlemen, representatives, a very good morning to you all. We shall therefore restart with the work of the United Nations Seminar on Assistance to the Palestinian People, with the second plenary session, which is entitled Palestinian National Development Plan 2014-2015, Long-Term Strategies of the State of Palestine for Economic Development and Growth. We shall hear presentations, and once they have been made, I will open the floor to the room, to participants and other speakers who would like to ask questions or to make any observations. And our speakers will then answer those questions. Before starting, though, I would like urgently to ask all of those who will take the floor to respect the speaking time, which is 15 minutes precisely, so that we can organize the debate properly. Our first speaker will be His Excellency Mr. Riyad Mansour, who is the permanent observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations in New York. He will give us an overview of the progress of the Palestinian Development Program, the financial difficulties that the State of Palestine is encountering as it strives to strengthen its public institutions and to promote economic development, and the impact on the Palestinian socio-economic fabric of the adhesion to the conventions. I think the Secretariat has given you an overview of the Palestinian Development Plan, which you can then perhaps convey to your respective capitals. Ambassador Mansour, we are really honored to have you here today, and I shall give you the floor now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. At the outset, I just want to say that I am not the most qualified person to introduce the National Development Plan for the year 2014 to 16. Our Minister of Planning, and who is also holding the post as the Minister of Finance, Shukri Bishara, would have been the most appropriate individual to give you, the briefing about the National Development Plan. And as a result of the emergency situation that exists in Palestine for the last at least for the last 3 weeks, it was not possible for the minister to be with us and to engage in such a discussion. So I extend apologies on behalf of him and the government for not being with us today to introduce the National Development Plan. However, in the spirit of transparency, our National Development Plan, one can find it in the website of the government, and it is a public document. It is a document that contains more than 160 pages for those who are experts and specialized individuals in studying national development plans. And we will be circulating to you an executive summary of that plan, and that summary is 20 pages plus. Again, it's a document for those who are interested in studying this subject in details. It's for experts and for people who are knowledgeable about national plans, economic plans, plans related to development, and so on and so forth. Yesterday, the presenters sort of put us in the atmosphere of where this plan is going to be implemented, and so many obstacles and difficulties for any planner and for the Palestinian government to implement anything. The situation in Gaza, it was described to us by a key UNRWA representative there it is so somber and so difficult, so that is an example of where this plan to be implemented. Another presenter yesterday gave us another picture of the cost of occupation to our economy and went through a detailed item by item of the cost that the occupation or the amount of money that occupation is taking from our economy. It's in the vicinity of about $7 billion. Another presenters gave us the tragedy of the situation of youth and women in the labor market today. I'm just giving you examples of where this plan is going to be implemented and the ambience of this plan in which it's supposed to be implemented. It is not like a normal situation of a given country where the government might be in complete control of its national resources and its territory and its borders and skies and natural resources in order to introduce a plan and to execute and implement that plan. I say all these things not to say that it is impossible to do anything under these horrible conditions and difficult conditions, but I say it in order for you to appreciate the fact that in spite of all these difficulties, that the Palestinian side is trying to provide the best possible services for its own people under such conditions, and to try to increase resources, although it is difficult, including resources from the donor countries, and to try to cut down as much as possible expenses. And also that is very difficult when you live under such conditions as we live under in occupation. So that's why we always have deficit. It is a normal thing for many countries. But the question for this plan and even previous plans is how can you cut this deficit to a reasonable amount of money. Now, I wanted to start with these things in order to put you in the proper frame of mind with regard to this National Development Plan for 3 years, 2014 to 2016. In this connection, that this is the third cycle of national plans that our government introduced. Two of them were introduced during the time of Prime Minister Salam Fayyad. A significant one of them at that time, and this plan is building on it, is building the infrastructure of a state in preparation of ending occupation and accomplishing independence. That was the second plan of Dr. Salam Fayyad. And if you recall that plan received high marks by the World Bank, the IMF, the European Union, and the AHLC. And they concluded in the year, if I am not mistaken, I believe the year 2011, that the Palestinian people and the Palestinian government is ready for running the affairs of a state and a government, and they have built institutions to carry that function, and they characterized our readiness as to run a state and a government not of an LDC nature, least developed state, but of a middle income state. Now, this plan came to build on it, and it's saying that the main objective is to continue building and consolidating institutions of a state for accomplishing the objective of sovereignty, meaning ending occupation and accomplishing the objective of independence of the state of Palestine. This plan is constructed on seven pillars of the approach to developing UNDP 2014 to 2016. These 7 pillars are the following. The first pillar is to enhance national ownership of the national planning process, meaning to encourage the fact that this is not a plan of an elite group of people, minority and imposed on our people, but it is encouraging the largest number of people to be partners and to feel that that they own this plan. So that the concept of ownership is one of the pillars. The other pillar is to be broad and effective participation, to involve the largest sector of the population in all parts of the occupied Palestinian territory. A third pillar is results-oriented planning and budgeting framework, meaning that you have to have measurable measures for the objectives that you put before you and to measure that they will be implemented. So it is a results-oriented plan. Another pillar is realistic and achievable outputs. The reason why it's realistic and achievable because of the difficult conditions and the restrictions imposed on us as a result of occupation and limitations of funding and so many other things that are related to our difficulties. Yesterday, Mr. Turner said that we are not in control of the situation in Gaza to decide what products to produce, how we can put it in the market, how to transport it to the markets where we can sell it, and so on and so forth. So therefore, you have to have realistic and achievable outputs related to the difficult realities in which we live in. Another pillar is institutionalized planning processes and enhanced accountability and transparency. I think in this regard, that from the time of the government of Dr. Salam Fayyad and moving forward, including during now the time of the government of Dr. Ramil Hamdallah, issues of fighting against corruptions, transparency, are things that many independent parties are really acknowledging and giving credit to the Palestinian government. And in fact, one of the conventions that we joined is a convention of fighting against corruptions, and the preliminary report that we prepared ahead of time, we showed it to examine the United Nations, and they were extremely impressed, and they said that if you submit a final text to us of such quality, we will give you an A for your report. So that there has been a deliberate effort by our side to have transparency, fighting corruptions, and spending the money exactly to the intended place where it should be implemented. And I should also add in this connection, we are unique in such a way that we are under close observation by the highest institutions under the sun for evaluating economic activities and how you spend public funds in the plan projects, and that the money goes to its objectives. When you are closely observed by the World Bank, by the IMF, by the European Union, by the AHLC, and for those of you who are not familiar with what is in the AHLC, it's all these institutions, in addition to the United States of America, in addition to a certain number of Arab countries, in addition also to Israel. When everything related to your economic development is being scrutinized by such agencies, that there is a very limited margin of corruptions and not spending money outside the objective targets for such money. Of course, this is an additional layer of I don't want to say restrictions, but close observation of how we conduct our business in the occupied territory. Therefore, whatever we plan and realistic, approved by all these agencies, it has to be executed in the best possible way. Another pillar is a gender responsive approach. Of course, those of us at the United Nations, women empowerment and gender issues is a huge issue, and it keeps repeating itself. And that is one of the pillars in this plan related to gender balance. And the last pillar is respect for human rights. And for those of you who are familiar with the 20 conventions and treaties that we have signed, the core of what we signed are the human rights treaties, the bulk of them. And now we are engaged in the preparation for writing our reports about these human rights treaties. And we are unique in a sense that when we joined these 20 treaties and conventions, the reason why I say 20, not 15, because many from our side refer to the Geneva Conventions and the first protocol as one, but in fact there are 5 altogether, so that's why we've signed 20, not 15. And we signed all of these things without a single reservation. Of course, we received tremendous praise for that, for our commitment to all the provisions of all these treaties and conventions. But of course, that we raised the bar so high as to our conduct and to our behavior. And in this connection, that the government will be busy in realigning our basic law, meaning our constitution, to conform with the requirements and the obligations that we have under the provisions of all these treaties and conventions. So then it becomes a very realistic pillar to say that respect for human rights, and we are implementing that through the joining of these treaties and conventions and through the preparation that is underway for meeting our obligations and for writing the reports that we're supposed to submit to Geneva, so that they can evaluate our commitment and our obligation and our practice in this field. Now, these are the pillars of this plan. Of course, that as you see in the document that we circulated to you, that there is more emphasis on more participatory approach to things, mainstream gender equality throughout the national planning process, and institutionalize a human rights-based approach to preparing this plan. Of course, that there are key challenges to the implementation of this plan. The first one is Israeli occupation, and I don't need to give you the details of that. Yesterday gave a sample of the difficulties imposed on us and the limitation to the implementation of this plan as a result of Israeli occupation. Another challenge is related to the internal political administrative divide. Now, in this connection, I think some yesterday spoke about how this new government of national consensus, how it is going to implement its plans and to ascertain its authority in the Gaza Strip, for example. There are tons of challenges there facing us, from what existed before the division, what existed after the division, how to deal with it in terms of employment, in terms of resources. All these are challenges that we are facing and that this plan is facing, and especially since the government became a national consensus government, because this plan was put in place before putting an end to the division by establishing the national consensus government. But this divide before establishing the national consensus and government and after establishing it, there are tremendous amount of challenges, to use Gaza as an example, facing us with regard to the Gaza Strip and the division and the ramification of the division and how to navigate through it. Another, of course, challenge is the deteriorating economic situation and financial crisis. Another challenge is related to poverty and unemployment, particularly affecting women and youth. And Munir yesterday gave us, a very comprehensive presentation related to this issue. But to put things also in a proper perspective, I'll refer to similar numbers that he referred to. Is poverty among individuals is 25.8%. Substantial discrepancy between the West Bank and Gaza exists. It is 17.8% poverty level is in the West Bank and 38.8% in the Gaza Strip. 12.9% suffer from extreme poverty, 7.8% in the West Bank and 21.1% in the Gaza Strip. An unemployment rate, and again, many of you refer to it, unemployment rate of 23.7% in the occupied Palestinian territory, 19.1% in the West Bank, 32.5% in the Gaza Strip. 43% unemployment of young people and aged between 20 and 24, 35% among them males and 75% among females. This is the unemployment rate. Disenfranchisement and marginalizations, high portion of youth are contemplating immigration. Female participation in the labor force is low. And I believe that Munir used yesterday that it is tragic, I think, I don't know exactly how he put it, to be a young youth, especially female, in the occupied Palestinian territory in these days. And I think that the plan is acknowledging that and factoring this in its priorities. Of course, the policy priorities for state formation under occupation are well known, that the base is a two-state solution on the basis of the 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Recover and build a knowledge-based national economy, continue the institution building process, achieve fiscal stability, improve effective state functions, and develop capacity to deliver equitable, high-quality public service, alleviate poverty and unemployment, and promote social justice, respect for human rights, integrity, transparency, and accountability, enhance the visibility of the State of Palestine in Arab, regional, and international forums, and meet necessary conditions to accede to various international treaties and conventions. We have done quite few in this regard, and I think that we will be doing more. Now, of course, that strategic objective of the economic development and employment, a key thing in this regard is investments creating employment opportunities have increased. Good governance and institution building sector, this is a strategic objective. We know in the UN, in every conference that we attend, in fact, when we talk about the MDGs, the SDGs, good governance is a key issue. And in this regard, more effective, efficient, and transparent management and allocations of public finances is a key thing in this plan. And also in this plan, they're giving, a big emphasis on local governments to be better capable in disseminating and delivering, programs. Meaning that, from bottom up, kind of approach. More effective delivery of and equitable access to public services, enhanced ability to provide security and access to justice, more effective Palestinian presence in Arab and international forums. Strategic objective in the social protection and development. Here, again, the gender issue, rights-based, and so on and so forth is key, concentrating on Palestinian youth, including male and female, is another element. Empower Palestinian women is also a very important issue. With regard to infrastructure, the objective here is to improve services for the Palestinian people in terms of the infrastructure, whether in terms of roads, in terms of energy supplies, water issues is extremely important, environmental issues, cultural approach. With regard, to water issues, you've heard, that the tragedy in the Gaza Strip, and the solution, the technology is available. The solution is desalination. The issue is funding and finding resources to do that. And I think that this is, a big burning issue with regard to Gaza, and we have to do it as quickly as possible because we have only a few more years to access water in Gaza before it goes completely unusable, especially for drinking water. Public expenditures plan concentrating in investment in growth and tackling unemployment and poverty. And also spending large amount of monies on projects for, in infrastructures and other areas, as I said, in the Gaza Strip, in the field of water, energy, and things of that nature. Monitoring and evaluation, again, as I said, everybody is watching us, everybody is reviewing our situation, which is good. In the Palestinian experience, not only in the economy, but in politics and everything else, we don't have secrets anymore. Everything that we do is on the open, on the table, and every Tom, Dick, and Harry is looking into our situation, evaluating our situation, criticizing our situation. This is not is bad. I believe that this is healthy. That is a testimony to our strength and to our diversity and to our democracy. We are not afraid of showing our shortages. In fact, I believe that we had a seminar one time in Vienna in which we invited at that time the Minister of Planning, and I think that my colleagues remember, from the Bureau, it was Dr. Ali Al-Jarbawi. He introduced the plan, and we invited several academicians from our universities and activists from civil society to critique, the plan, so that we brought Palestinian leaders to introduce the plan, and we brought Palestinian activists to evaluate the plan, and there was a lot of diversities and divisions. I'll give you an example. Many of the academicians, and they might apply this to this plan as well, they said that there is less allocation of money for education, for health, for these key sectors, of services to the public, and there is more money for security. And there was a lively debate that took place under these conditions, but of course there were limitations to some of the issues that they were introduced, because my colleagues from the academia who are criticizing the plan and saying that there is less money being spent in the field of education and health, they were not factoring the large amount of money being spent by UNRWA in the same fields of education and health. And you cannot be really comprehensive in terms of the total amount of money spent in the Palestinian economy and in the services sectors in education and health, for example, without factoring all the money spent in these fields, including the money spent by the different UN agencies, so that when you put all these amounts together, then you can see a different pictures in terms of the numbers if you want to compare them, for example, to the amount of money spent on security. So the conclusion of this plan, that the status quo or real change, and I think that Quito will talk a lot about this thing. The status quo is where we are. This plan, if it is executed to its most positive aspect, then it could take us to double or maybe more than the GDP that we have now. The status quo will keep us as where we are, and it depends on many factors. related to the situation, related to the restrictions of the occupation, and related to how we execute this plan in the best possible manner. If we do these things in the best conditions, then there will be, a real change in a positive direction, meaning that we will see significant change from the status quo. If not, then the status quo, and therefore, that the plan will not be as ambitious as it like to be, and it might not accomplish the objectives that one would hope for from the sort of the optimistic side. Again, as I said, I'm not the expert in giving you a good summary of this plan, but I tried my best, and I hope that this will help my other colleagues in engaging, in a lively discussion about our national development plan. Sorry for being a little bit longer than I should have, and I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very instructive presentation. You have given us a panorama of the obstacles that face economic and institutional development in a situation of occupation. We would also like to note with satisfaction that the government of the State of Palestine is persevering, whatever the difficulties, and I think that it's important to highlight this. Knocking on all doors, trying to take benefit from the possibilities that are offered through the historic resolution, through which the United Nations has recognized Palestine as an observer state. The international community must assume its responsibilities and provide without reservation its support to the development plan for Palestine and disburse the funds that have been promised to stabilize the public finance of this country. I thank you once again, Ambassador. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Kito Deboer, the incoming director for the Initiative for the Palestinian Economy in Dubai. I should recall that this initiative, which is to stimulate private investment in Palestine, has received the strong support of the American Secretary of State, Mr. John Kerry, and the representative of the Quartet, Mr. Tony Blair. We wait with great interest for the presentation of the situation, particularly given the impasse that the peace process is facing at the moment and the instability that there is on the ground. Mr. Kito Deboer, you have the floor.
Good morning. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is...
Microphone, please, for the speaker. Microphone.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to start off by just congratulating His Excellency. I have part of what I have to do is work on developing plans such as this for Palestine, and I've read many from around the region, and I have to say it is an excellent document. It's well structured, well informed, and well written, and I'd just like to pass on my congratulations to the people who must have put a lot of hard work into preparing that. I'd commend it to everybody in this audience. What I would like to do is give you a background on the initiative for the Palestinian economy, some context to that, then run quickly through some of the key recommendations. I have a presentation which I think is longer than we have time for, so I'll go through it quite quickly. That is just to give you a flavor of what's there. Everything I'm referring to is in the public domain. If you go to the OQR website, you'll see a section there on the Initiative for the Palestinian Economy. I will also make reference to work and a report for the Portland Trust, which is called Beyond Aid, which is also relevant here. You can go to their website and gain access to that as well. And I will close with a very quick assessment of where we are, recognizing that events move very quickly in the region. The work for the IPE was finished about a year ago, and conditions have changed quite a lot, and I can give you a quick update on where we stand at the moment. So as background, the journey to IPE starts more than 2 years ago with some work that I was involved with the Portland Trust, which I made reference to. We were involved in putting some input into their 15-year strategy for the Palestinian economy under the status quo. The Portland Trust does a lot of work between Israel and Palestine. It is well regarded. And the work that we did there was done through an advisory board of leading Palestinian business people and members from the Palestinian Authority, most notably Dr. Mohammed Mustafa. Coming out of this work was a recognition that the main challenge for Palestine on the economic dimension was to create 1 million jobs over the next 15 years in order to get unemployment down below 8%. So that 1 million jobs over 15 years became pretty much an anchor of everything that we did subsequently. We also noted that the context was unfortunate and difficult given that objective, that private sector investment had fallen by 40% in 4 years, and at about 8% of GDP, that was at least half, probably a third of what you would expect it to see in any comparable economy. So there was an enormous need to increase the level of private sector investment. And we also noted that trade with Israel at $4 billion was about 3 times higher than the rest of the world. And in many ways, the Palestinian economy was captive of the Israeli economy. It was an adjunct of it, and that one of the areas of focus would be on import substitution. Imports from Israel are about the same size as production within the Palestinian territories. So those were the sort of areas of focus that came out of the work done for the Portland Trust. If you then relate that work to the work that was being done for the National Development Plan, the base case in the National Development Plan assumes the status quo, and the types of numbers in terms of GDP growth and job creation that came in the Portland work is comparable to that of the NDP. They're very consistent. When the new administration in the US came in about 18 months ago, the priority for the administration was on a foreign policy front was twofold. One was the discussions with Iran, and the second was to pursue the peace process. And very early on, Secretary Kerry reached out to Tony Blair at the Quartet and said, what we would like to do is develop an economic plan on the assumption of peace. Because Mr. Blair was aware of the work that we had done for the Portland, he suggested that we try to re-look at the work that we had done for them, assuming the status quo, and look at something that they refer to more as a Marshall Plan. What would you do the day after peace was made? What would the areas of focus be, and how we would be moved forward on that? And that became the work for IPE. It was in many ways complementary to the work for the Portland. We had as a vision to increase investment by at least $10 billion, look to create 250,000 jobs. It was going to be primarily private sector focused, and it would also look very much at the enablers. The process that we used to put IPE together was quite similar to that of the Portland Trust. It again was a bottom-up process, working closely with the Palestinian Authority and the local business community. It involved 18 industry advisors, 100 local experts. We had multiple industry meetings, and we had the advisory board. And coming out of this was a report that we tried to reinforce the notion of a public-private sector mindset. We focused on viable projects. We looked at the size of investment, were the investments likely to be economically viable and to create jobs. And one thing just to highlight coming out of this is that if this plan could be implemented in terms of tax revenue for the Palestinian government, it would be about $650 million additional tax revenue. That's about 60% of donor aid, and it's about 20% of all the Palestinian current income. And a thought behind this is that to stimulate the private sector is a way to get stronger resilience in the economy and stronger independence. So before going into the substance and just running through the charts, a few observations. The first is coming in from the outside with a private sector mindset. The economy is small. $10 billion is simply an absolutely small economy. The 27 engineers who founded WhatsApp were bought out for $24 billion. So just the starting point for any discussion with multinationals is actually, this is just very small and quite complicated. If you want to go to GE and say, let's build a power station, in reality for them it's much easier and more economical to sell another couple of jet engines to Emirates Airlines than to go through the difficulty of going to Palestine. Having said that, there's a lot of goodwill and a lot of people who are interested in doing it. They just need to have more help to understand the realities and the opportunities. It's not an area that the outside world is focusing on. It's not an area that the outside world knows well. And that may come as a surprise to a lot of the NGOs and the multilateral institutions working in Palestine. But from the international business world, Palestine is seen as being small, corrupt, and difficult. There's a lot of mindset that needs to be overcome. And in reality, once you get inside, you find that the reality is actually quite different from the mindset. And I think there needs to be more of a concerted effort to actually show what has been accomplished and what has been achieved. The second thing is that actually there's a very strong foundation. I started my career in Eastern Europe, helping to rebuild Eastern Europe. The situation in Palestine in terms of fundamentals is much stronger. They were dealing with a communist regime. They didn't understand capitalism. The first starting point was that you're going to have to fire a lot of people because under communism, the one thing they may not have been real jobs, but they had jobs. But in Palestine, what you have is a very lean and mean and very impressive private sector who understand very clearly what economic reality is, and they will be off to a running start the moment they get the shackles left off them. So there is a very strong, I think, starting point. There are a resilient private sector. However, it is quite small. The total profits being generated by the companies in the Palestinian Stock Exchange is about $350 million a year. That's quite a small pool of money. And I think one of the things that needs to be thought through is how do you expand that and make that private sector stronger? And most of that $350 million comes really just from the telecom sector. The other thing as an observation about the strong foundation is the government itself. It's a relatively new government. I think of this as being the third era that it's about to move into. The first era was about founding a state. It was primarily about politics in the Arafat era. The second was about building a state, which was very much about institution building. It was about Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad. And I think now we're beginning to get into the third era, which is really about growing a state and making it more resilient, and that's about a focus on economics. So it's part of a bigger picture, and I think that the plan reflects that. The plan repeatedly talks about the necessity to unshackle the economy and to focus on building the private sector. And finally, I think the other observation is yes, this is an economy under occupation. That is the principal issue. You will never be able to achieve anything like its full potential unless the politics is solved. All of that is abundantly clear. The IPE is not about economic peace. It is not about trying to substitute economics for politics. However, it is clear that there is much work that can be done, even under the current conditions, to move things forward. And I'd like just to quote one of the sentences from the National Development Plan, which says, "We plan to tackle poverty and unemployment head-on, working closely and constructively with the private sector." The reality of it is, it's the private sector. It really is the principal mechanism for job creation that's there. And that there are areas like developing stronger relationships with the diaspora, where there's a lot that can still be done, in areas like energy, agriculture, and, as I mentioned earlier, import substitution. What I am now going to do, my limited time left, is I'm going to go through very quickly the core of the recommendations of the work that we came up with. There are a number of charts. I will go through them. I'm not expecting you to read them. I'm just going to show them to you so you understand the type of work that we were doing and you get a sense of what the recommendations were. The core of the recommendations was to focus on 8 economic sectors. If you relate those to the NDP, the NDP talks about 3 sectors of priority in the NDP under infrastructure, which are energy, water and wastewater, and housing. And it talks about 5 industrial sectors, which are agriculture, tourism, ICT, building materials, and light manufacturing. That's what the Palestinian plan says. Our plan is completely consistent with that. We talk about 8 sectors, and the 8 sectors we talk about in IP are the same as the 8 in the NDP. This is not an accident. We worked closely with the Palestinian Authority to make sure that we were working hand in glove. Very much our mindset was that the economic plan had to be a Palestinian economic plan, and our role was to work with the Palestinian authorities and others to try to help implement it. So we talk about 8 sectors which are consistent with the NDP. We talk about 50 projects. Most of those projects are ones that people were familiar with. We make no apology for that. We did not see our role as being to create and invent new projects. Our approach was to say, let's understand what is already out there and how can we make what's actually out there happen. We focus on the enablers and on the organization. So if you'll bear with me, I'll run through the charts quite quickly and then just close with a status update of where we are. So this is a summary of the economic initiatives that we laid out. I just point number 4. The work we do is tied to clear political, regulatory and economic enablers. We understood that whilst much could be done within Palestine without the support of the Israeli authorities, in the end there's an opportunity here for economics to also drive a political change, and we saw it in that context. In terms of the methodology, I've run through that with you just to reinforce the fact that we're trying to be practical, actionable, and that we took a ground-up approach that linked with what was already happening within the territories. In terms of the aspirations, we've talked a lot about this. It is about trying to enable and unleash the private sector. We're trying to achieve 50% GDP growth, over 600 million of tax revenues, with it primarily focused and funded by the private sector. We chose the sectors at the top: energy, tourism, light manufacturing, ICT, agriculture and construction. On the left-hand side, it shows you the contribution to GDP. On the right-hand side, it talks to you about the size of the labor. What you'll see is agriculture and construction accounts for about 40% of labor. That is what really matters in terms of job creation. Then we looked at some of the main pillars. The pillars were providing private sector-driven infrastructure, unlocking the intrinsic potential of the economy, and accelerating flagship sectors. We talk about building 100,000 houses, talk about enterprise zones, talking about model farms and extension services and agriculture, talking about Gaza Marine, etc. This I do want you all to read and remember, and there will be a test afterwards. These are the 50 projects that we identified. I have no intention of going through these in detail. I will take tourism as one example and just run through that in some more detail. So that's just one example in greater depth. So let's just quickly run through the sort of thing we talk about in tourism. We talk about the size, we describe the sector, it's pretty small and fragmented. We then look at where does tourism fit in the context of global or regional tourism, and you see that in the Palestinian territories you've got fewer tourist visits than you do to Yemen, so it's very small, it's fragmented. However, when you look at the assets that Palestine has, it's got assets for tourism that I think many people in the world would be envious of. You have things like Bethlehem, Jericho, East Jerusalem, you've got beaches, you've even got a famous Banksy mural on the wall. There are plenty of things for plenty of people who they would like to go and see. And it's about trying to find ways of actually unlocking that. There's probably few parts of the world that have as much tourism potential per square kilometre as the Palestinian territories do under the right circumstances. We then talk about what's the opportunity in terms of GDP and job creation over a 3 and 6 year period. We then talk about the strategy that's required. A lot of that is about just getting your internal house organized, getting some marketing spend, working more closely with your neighbors to build integrated packages, and trying to make some destination locations. And we're seeing things like in Jericho, you've got the Jericho Wall tourism site. These are going to become destination sites. And in Bethlehem, you have a number of ideas being developed as well. If we look now overall at what did the initiative say, it said the potential growth over a 3 year period after, if the political situation got better, we believed that you could increase the GDP by 50% to $15.8 billion. If you go to the NDP, you will see that they have a base case scenario and an optimistic scenario, and their optimistic scenario over 3 years is 16 billion. So it's almost exactly the same, very consistent with that. If you look at the number of employment, you see that it results in about 400,000 jobs. So you see that there's plenty of opportunity for fast growth if the politics permit it. We have a whole list of 23 enablers. Many of these enablers are going to be dependent upon the Israeli occupying forces. However, there are a number which are also within the control of the Palestinian Authority. These are ones that are recognized by the PA, and where they need help is on trying to address a number of these. When we talked about the financing of principles, we focused primarily on the private sector. If you look at the amount of money that's needed, which is talked about here, where is it going to come from? You see about 6 billion if you look at the bottom under the grand total of the first column. The first column talks about 6 billion of private sector money, about $3 billion of loans on top of that. Some of that will have to be underwritten by international agencies. There will be some public sector loans and some grants. And you have a number of people like the Portland Trust beginning to think about innovative forms of funding. Development impact bonds is one that they're pioneering, and grant leveraging is another. We talk about where the funding can come from. We have here, how do we get to $655 million of tax revenue? We talk about some of the delivery mechanism, how do we actually make this happen? We reinforce the fact that what we need here is to work very closely with stakeholders, particularly with the Palestinian Authority, that what we are trying to do is to build a stronger private sector focus with private sector people from the private sector, experts coming in to build that capability. And the closing slide that I wanted to show you was simply a quote from the NDP, which I don't want to read here in detail, but it says in the first part that there have been many people who've contributed to the NDP. It specifically references the IPE, but it makes the caveat that all of these plans are going to be contingent upon the political situation. So that's what IPE is. That was some of its background. This gives you a very quick flavor of what's in the report. Very quickly, where do we stand today? The funding for the OQR, which is going to be the mechanism by which IPE will be delivered, has been increased. At least the funding from the US and the Canadian side has. There is also going to be a separate funding to build the private sector team for IPE. They'll probably need about a dozen people from the private sector, and that funding is in process, and we hope that that will be completed soon. There's a program already becoming underway to try to engage with the diaspora. Just as an observation, I know quite a lot of diaspora Palestinians. They're very eager to help. What is interesting is that their views on Palestine are really a decade old. It's hard for them to get into Palestine. They know what they know from times before. They've seen it as being very political and also quite corrupt. And when you actually show them the facts on the ground, they get to be much more motivated about organizing to be part of the solution. So the diaspora is something that we've been engaging on actively. In Gaza as well, discussions with the Israelis and Kogat at a very early stage that were the consensus government to be able to deliver a new government in the Palestinian territories, that would open up the opportunity and the necessity for a very large-scale rebuilding of Gaza. As they say, we will not interfere with that. It's in their strategic interest to have a stable Gaza. That was 2 weeks ago, so maybe they've changed their mind in the intervening 2 weeks. But I think there's a recognition, even once all this is through, that something very significant has to happen in Gaza, and there's a role to be played there. There are things like we're focusing on trying to look at things like solar energy, which is less dependent upon Israeli support. Tourism, ICT, there's already a lot happening there in terms of offshoring and value-added services. More can be done. And finally, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of capability developing. As the plan says, your plan says there have been 1,200 people gone through vocational training. The need in Palestine is multiples of that. And if we are going to build industry sectors like ICT, there has to be a more wholesale approach to trying to develop the talent amongst the youth. So at that point, I will thank you for your patience.
I would like to thank Mr. de Boer for sharing his views with us, in particular the way in which we can mobilize private investment to move from growth based on aid, we saw that at the beginning, to growth which is really autonomous. I would like to express our gratitude to you because what you said really has enriched our work. I would also like to say to the extent to which the committee appreciates the initiative and the extraordinary action that you're taking for the Palestinian people. Because, of course, there are limits to aid that international donors can give to meet the urgent needs of the Palestinians in terms of development. And you really stressed the importance of the private sector intervening to cover the shortfall. Attracting private investment to an occupied land, well, of course, it's no easy task. And of course, this is a land at conflict. And so we wish you all the best in that undertaking. Once again, it is a privilege to have you here today, so thank you very much.
Deval, the project manager for VNG International, which is an international cooperation agency of the Association of the Netherlands Communes. Mr. Deval is particularly interested in drawing up and implementing projects for strengthening local administration in Europe, in the Middle East, and in North Africa, with specific projects being set up in Palestine. Mr. Deval is going to speak to us about local economic development and the capacity of local administration in Palestine. It is a pleasure, Mr. Deval, to have you with us. I now give you the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I would like to thank the organization for organizing this event and for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I would also like to thank the other experts who spoke yesterday and earlier today for their very interesting presentations. I also would like to congratulate Ambassador Mansour with the new National Development Plan. I've only been able to read the summary, but I join Mr. Quito de Boer's assessment that it looks very comprehensive and complete, and I look forward to reading the full document. So my congratulations there. I would like to make a small contribution also to this seminar by focusing on the local context and roles municipalities can play in promoting economic development in Palestine. I was invited about 2 weeks ago for this seminar, and with one of the key focal points of this plenary session being the strengthening of state institutions to promote economic development in Palestine, which is what my organization is currently engaged in Palestine on the local level. So what I would like to do is to run with you through this presentation looking at this topic of institution building and economic development from a local government perspective, see what roles local government institutions in Palestine can play in promoting economic development, and finally also show you how international decentralized cooperation can be a tool for development of this particular development. I'm also sure that the following speaker will also address this issue. What I'm going to do today is I'll start off with a very brief, also for the sake of time, brief introduction of VNG International, because I believe that most of the people here are not familiar with our work. Then I'll move on quickly to assessing the Palestinian local context, the economic situation, and especially also the role and position of local governments. And I will do this specifically by looking at the current programs that we are implementing in Palestine at this moment, which is our local government capacity program, which we are implementing together with MDLF, the Municipal Development and Lending Fund, which is a PA, an autonomous PA institution, and our new Rawabi pilot program, in which we have joined with the new city of Rawabi to see how we can help its development. But more on that later. So a brief introduction of VNG International. We are the international agency of the Association of Netherlands Municipalities. It's the last time I'm going to say that. We work in over 45 countries supporting local governments and their associations in building their capacity. This is our motto. We are committed to strengthening democratic local government worldwide. We have a head office in The Hague, but we have various field offices in the countries where we work, also a small office in Ramallah. These are some of the areas of expertise that we work in. So obviously decentralization, intergovernmental relations, the management and finance of local governments and their associations. We foster international cooperation between local governments.
support local governments in their responsibilities in the field of infrastructure and services, association capacity building, and in some cases also conflict prevention, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction. How we usually like to work is that we focus on specific needs. Since we work with local governments, the needs of local governments are often very specific. We always see local governments or their associations or other partners we have as our equal partners in developing our programs. What we bring to the table is practical local government experience. We have access, of course, to the local government sector in the Netherlands, but through our work in other countries, also extensive networks in other developing countries or Europe or any other region in the world. What we like to pride ourselves on is our colleague-to-colleague approach, which means that we always seek to bring local government officials and employees from all over the world in contact with colleagues in the countries where we work in order to engage in a fruitful conversation which can be beneficial for both parties. So also in the case of Palestine, we have done this. So our programs are usually developed by a mixed team of national and international experts, and when I say national experts, I mean experts from the country in which we work. The experts we provide can be local government officials or employees or former local government officials and employees, private sector professionals, staff from VNG itself, of course, and external experts that we can hire on a consultant basis. Most of our programs contain study visits either to the Netherlands or other countries. We provide coaching and mentoring for local governments and their associations, and we organize workshops and trainings in the fields of expertise I mentioned before. We've been active in Palestine since 1996, starting out with supporting the establishment of the Association of Palestinian Local Authorities, APLA, in 1996 until 2004. Following that, we partnered with UNDP in a program named the Municipal Alliance for Peace in the Middle East, which tried, with the emphasis on tried, to develop concrete project proposals in which Palestinian and Israeli municipalities could work together. Our activities in this program ended in 2012. It's still under supervision of UNDP, who is trying to continue this program, but it seems unlikely under the current political circumstances. At the same time, we were also implementing our Logo South program, which was also a capacity development program for Palestinian municipalities on the West Bank. And we supported the formulation of a program of the Belgian Development Agency on regeneration of historical centers. Currently, we are active with our two programs I mentioned before, and which I will discuss in more detail later on, which is our local government capacity program, which focuses on strengthening the capacity of local governments in Palestine in the field of local economic development. We are currently supporting 37 municipalities, and part of the program is also a grant scheme, and 12 Palestinian municipalities will be able to implement a project of their own. And also the Rabawi pilot program I mentioned earlier. More on that later. I'd like to move on to the local economic context text in Palestine. A lot of this has been mentioned, of course, already yesterday and earlier today. Of course, it goes without saying that the current political situation and the occupation of the Palestinian territory is the most problematic situation and is causing the Palestinian economy the most trouble. A resolution needs to be found for this issue. However, I think it's also good to look at the local economic situation in Palestine and what municipalities can do both in the short term and in the long term within a independent Palestinian state. We have a certain approach to local economic development. We like to use this quote by the World Bank, in which we define local economic development as a process in which public, business and non-governmental sector partners work collectively to create better conditions for economic growth and employment generation. This is particularly interesting when you look at local governments, because we believe the main driving force behind decentralization is the fact that every city, area, or community is unique and has its own competitive advantages. Therefore, a successful local economic development program focuses on identifying and exploiting these competitive advantages of a community or an area. When we look at the Palestinian economy in particular, we see that micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises constitute the majority of the economy, and we believe that these types of enterprises can benefit greatly from successful LED programs. To that end, also I would like to say that look at what can local governments in Palestine then do to do this, to achieve this. They have a permanent and stable position since they are the level of government that is closest to the community and therefore can have a large impact on the local community through the delivery of essential services, the purchases of goods and services, or through the creation of an enabling environment. In order to do this, they need to improve their dialogue with the private sector and civil society. They can identify innovative solutions to business problems and develop policy orientations emphasizing local economic growth and job creation strategies. The interesting thing, of course, of local economic development is it focuses on local businesses who are more likely to employ local people, provide local services, spend money locally, and promote social cohesion. We believe that supporting local businesses can thus prevent leaks, if you want to call it, from local economies by retaining local spending and investment. Another interesting fact is that by its nature, often local government enjoys higher levels of confidence with their local communities than central governments. This was also confirmed by a survey done by the World Bank in the Palestinian territory that identified that the local level was seen as less problematic to work with than the central government. However, implicit in this is that local governments have an understanding of the comparative advantages of their local economies, and particularly the constraints that restrict these comparative advantages. We have an approach to LED in which we define 4 different roles local governments can play. Again, stressing that a lot of these roles are very difficult for local governments and municipalities in Palestine at this moment to play due to the current occupation. The most simple form local governments can play is as a service provider. They are responsible for capital investment with regard to the provision and upgrading of maintenance of services, including perhaps partnerships with the private sector. They can act as a regulator. If there are various interests, it can take a single entity to regulate the actions of others to ensure the common good, to develop LED strategies, to integrate developmental objectives, priorities, strategies, and programs, environmental impact, cross-cutting issues, and coordinate local economic objectives with other municipal programs that are linked to the national development planning process. Another very interesting role for local governments, I think, especially in Palestine, can be that of a catalyst, which means that they proactively create conducive circumstances for local economic development. They can provide or restrict opportunities. Restriction is not always negative, by the way. It could include the roles of the activities of a municipality could include flexible use of municipal planning and zoning, data and information provision, commercial property rates, development and maintenance of infrastructure, but also provision of industrial or manufacturing estates, lower rents, business incubators, MSME support, spatial planning, and things like that. The last part, it's called an entrepreneur here, which is maybe not the perfect name, but it means that a local government can engage in investment attraction, place marketing, develop advanced partnerships with the private sector to better exploit municipal resources for new market opportunities. This is a most risk-taking role of all, and if you engage in this activity, a solid understanding of the risks and your local economic situation is required. Why I'm not very happy with the name entrepreneur is because I want to stress that in our view, local governments should work together with the private sector and should not be seen as entrepreneurs themselves who might compete with the private sector. So that's very important, also in alignment, of course, with the earlier discussions we had with a private sector-led growth of the Palestinian economy, which we fully embrace and agree with. So municipalities can also promote local enterprises not only by direct public investments, but also stimulate investments by creating an attractive local business environment through simplifying the procedures for licensing and permits, or in some cases, especially maybe of larger cities, they can try and raise a specific municipal profile through improving their communication and marketing strategies, especially in the field of tourism. This can be very interesting for cities like, for instance, Bethlehem. However, this is all idealist talk. Local governments in Palestine face a lot of challenges. First of all, of course, the ongoing occupation. Municipalities at this moment are tasked mainly with the provision of 6 basic services: solid waste disposal, street maintenance, water, road maintenance, school maintenance, and street lighting. When it comes to local economic development, the mandate is not entirely clear, so it differs between municipalities how far they are willing to go in playing a role in local economic development. At this moment, they need to improve their capacity in planning and identification of priorities. Of course, they are also suffering from a declining revenue from taxes. The information and economic data is lacking sometimes, which was also mentioned in a previous presentation for private sectors. There is a limited awareness of competitive advantages. There is a lack of capability, and maybe in some cases also a willingness to liaise with private sector. And there needs to be an improvement in service delivery, especially also in a cooperation and consultation of the private sector and civil society partners, which is why I'm very excited also about the presentation by Ambassador Mansour, who really also mentioned the importance of public participation and improvement of services on the local government level. The first step already has been taken. There is a so-called SDIP framework, which was initiated by the PA. SDIP stands for Strategic Development and Investment Plan. All municipalities in Palestine have developed a plan like this. It does articulate private sector involvement and sometimes local economic development. However, they consist mainly of identifying local project needs and preparing a project pipeline for funding, and not actually on building an enabling business environment or improving the capacity of the local government. So there is room for improvement there. So this is all more about the Palestinian context, the role local governments can play. What I would like to do now is look at our local government capacity program and see in which ways we are currently as VNG International together with MDLF trying to improve the services delivered by municipalities in this regard. Our program is funded by the Dutch government. Its objective is to increase the capacity of Palestinian municipalities to enhance, organize, and institutionalize local economic development. By working together with MDLF, the activities we implement are coordinated with the Ministry of Local Government of the PA and various international donors who are also active within MDLF. At the same time, we also offer trainings and capacity building for MDLF and the Ministry of Local Government staff who are involved in our program. Recently, about a year or 2 years ago, the Ministry of Local Government has created a LED unit as well, with which we collaborate extensively. Besides general trainings, I mentioned that we offer a grant scheme. This was developed in cooperation with MDLF, who run a lot of grant schemes for Palestinian municipalities. What we have done is we have selected 37 eligible municipalities on the West Bank. They were selected on basis of their current capacity as identified by MDLF, and organized 2 cycles in which we will seemingly run a run-of-the-mill grant scheme. We invite municipalities during a call for concept notes to deliver their ideas on how they want to improve their local economies and how they need to improve their capacity in order to achieve that goal. We will evaluate those and ask them, a number of them, to write a full proposal. However, before the grant scheme kicks off, all municipalities receive trainings on participatory planning, identifying local economic competitive advantages, engaging with the private sector, and they are asked during their writing of the concept notes to show how they have consulted their private sector, how they have consulted civil society actors, and where exactly their problem lies and how they can improve that. All concept notes and proposals are assessed by independent assessors and cross-checked also by MDLF. This is a picture of the municipalities engaged. All of them are currently in the West Bank. This is due to the fact that our program is funded by the Dutch government, who would only open up funding for municipalities on the West Bank. But I'm happy to say that there's a almost similar program running on Gaza as well, being implemented by GIZ with Swiss funding. We have finished one round of our grant scheme. Currently we have 5 pilot municipalities. They are listed here: Ramallah, Bir Zaid, Al Bira, Tubas, and Al Samu. For instance, Bir Zaid focusing on a cultural and tourist path, clearly linking their program to tourism, and have engaged together with private sector enterprises and civil society organizations to see how they can frame their city more in a tourist way, and how the creation of a particular path can lead to interesting cooperation linkages and support the development of a tourist economy in Bir Zaid. Since I'm already going a little bit long, I think, I also would like to focus a little bit on the Rawabi pilot program, which we are also organizing. I think most of you are familiar with the Rawabi project. It's a new city being built in Palestine. This picture is probably already dated again, since I think a lot more has been constructed since it was taken. Our pilot program was initiated during a bilateral forum between the Netherlands national government and the Palestinian Authority in November 2013, in which representatives of the municipality of Rawabi expressed the need for local governance expertise for best practices in strategic planning and municipal management. So we, as VNG International, in close cooperation with the Dutch municipality of Almere and other Dutch municipality, were able to offer the expertise and hoped to be able to serve as a liaison for Dutch best practices. What we did is we organized a study visit during which representatives of the city of Rawabi visited the Netherlands. They met mayors and municipal experts in Zoetermeer, Deventer, Almere, and Amsterdam. So I'm also giving you a little bit of a topographical lesson in Dutch cities. The covered areas they discussed were urban and strategic planning, financial and waste management, smart cities, citizen participation, and regional cooperation. So this was really a VNG international approach. During the visit in Zoetermeer, The delegates of the city of Rawabi visited two experts of the city of Zoetermeer, one a communication employee, the other a city planner, who had developed a strategy in Zoetermeer to frame Zoetermeer as a place for recreation and in which the municipality invested in recreational sites and large-scale projects to make that possible. Since similar programs and ideas are also currently being made in Rawabi, they have been requested to Rawabi later this year and assist the city of Rawabi as well in developing a similar plan, where you can see how decentralized international cooperation can provide an interesting tool to support the development of the capacity of municipalities in other places. Brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope to show that local economic development initiatives can offer both short and long-term improvement in economic perspectives in Palestine. Currently, under the occupation, it is very difficult to work, but still, a support to local enterprises can help create slightly better economic perspectives in the local area, but in the long term, they will also help create competitive economic areas spread out over all the Palestinian territory, who can function properly within an independent state as well, and spur private sector investment and development. I hope that I was able to show you that local governments can play a role in stimulating this local economic development. However, that they are currently limited in their capacity to do so in Palestine. So I hope that future economic plans and initiatives take this also into account when writing their plans, and I already saw it to my great delight in the National Development Plans summary, also to look at their limited capacity. Finally, also I would like to again ask your attention for municipal development cooperation, decentralized cooperation, international cooperation that can be a valuable tool for building institutional capacity of local governments. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup,
Thank you very much, Mr. Deval, for sharing with us your vast experience when it comes to capacity building and economic development at a local level. I think I can say that your presentation has given an entirely new dimension to our work. All too often, we focus on major projects and overall global solutions, but whereas you have seen the advantages of working at a local level. So thank you very much once again. Now we shall hear from Mr. Etienne Butzbach, who is a former French politician and a former mayor of Belfort in France. Mr. Butzbach is a doctor by trade. He has a degree in political sciences and he teaches at the Institute of European Studies at the University of Paris. He was also chair of the Decentralized Cooperation Fund for Palestine, and he is an active member of Cités Unies in France, which is a federation which groups together 500 French territorial groups involved in international cooperation. He is going to speak to us about the initiative called Diplomacy in Towns and Decentralized Cooperation in Palestine, to give us an overview and prospects for the future. So thank you very much, Mr. Butzbach, for coming to this meeting, and I shall now give you the floor. Well, thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much for organizing this initiative, which is particularly timely at the dramatic situation we're seeing today. As was said yesterday, when we think at the worst case scenario, well, that has never been entirely eliminated, but I think that we can testify to the willingness around this table, and we can see that there are prospects for the future in spite of the problems. I think thank you very much for the team who have effectively organized these exchanges, and thank you also to Mr. Mansour for representing the Palestinian Authority. I shall move on, but my information will complement what has already been said because it pertains to the political domain, and it will therefore complement the previous speech and draw the attention of your assembly to the links that we have between Europe and the Middle East in terms of cooperation. And I will also show you that cooperation can act as levers at a strategic level in Palestine and pertaining to the different economic initiatives that can be taken. So first of all, just to give you the context in which this decentralized cooperation between France and Palestine has been set up, it's not recent, it goes back to 1994, and in fact some politicians, including myself, were involved in military cooperation with the Maghreb, with Turkey, within the context of programs between Europe and in the Mediterranean area. Some promises were not all maintained, but we are nevertheless aware of the importance of relations between Europe and the Middle East, and we're also aware of the blockade for the entirety of the Mediterranean of the situation in Palestine and the stalemate in which the region of the world was involved. Well, of course, there can't be sustainable development in the Mediterranean as a whole unless we solve the conflict in Israel and Palestine. This concerns all populations in the region, as I say. After the Oslo agreements, that is why we wanted to have a delegation from France, and I in fact was there in Jericho. We were about 40 of us there with Palestinian representatives, and we had discussions at that time with the Prime Minister back then in order to launch the cooperation we have. This issue of municipalities and collective groups is particularly important in Palestine, with a paradox where we have to bolster the state. Is it desirable to strengthen at the same time decentralized bodies? Well, we think that there isn't a contradiction, but rather there is complementarity there. And it is in that unprecedented context, I think, I'm not sure there is a similar context in the world, in fact, where a state has to be constructed. And so that is the issue of collective groups is of particular importance. As a result of that, we decided not to become involved in bilateral cooperation, but to build a network for decentralized cooperation in Palestine. First of all, we had a fund because we thought it was very important that we could base our work in concrete projects. The credibility of this, of course, relates to the results achieved on the ground. We've seen this in Palestine, that it's not just talking about public policies, it's a question of what actually happens on the ground as a result of action taken for citizens. So we wanted to carry out this approach in very many areas. First of all, we had a town-to-town approach with partnerships between French cities and Palestinian cities, but also a cross-cutting program which aimed to focus on all collectivities with the European Commission and our own forces. We aimed how we could group together stakeholders in order to help move this forward. And thanks to the support of the European Commission, we were able to put in place a training system for stakeholders in about 20 Palestinian cities. We also had a branch or office in Ramallah. We spoke about the importance of diaspora, the very important role of that between France and Palestine, the links that there are between young Palestinians who came to study in France, and we are very we think that this is a very important area to strengthen our cooperation in local realities. And then finally, we have institutional support through the creation of local bodies in Palestine. We also supported that work, and we have regular contact with that cooperation there. So we built these long-term partnerships. I'm going to cite some of them which have been going on for more than 20 years, so they've stood the test of time, and I think this is very important. I will just mention some of the problems. We have partnership between Dunkirk and Gaza. Dunkirk is a port in France, and we think it's a very important partnership there. It's very important not to forget any part of Palestine. Even though it was difficult to intervene in the Gaza Strip, we nevertheless think it's a priority to do so. We also have a partnership between Lille and Nablus. Lille is a very large French town which has over 1 million inhabitants, and there is a link with Nablus, and there has been one for more than 20 years. We have a relationship between Saint-Denis, about 3 million people living there in Paris, and also the areas of Tokaram, Jenin and Kalkilia. We also have a partnership between Belfort and Hebron, and then also some towns in the Rhône-Alpes area with districts in Bethlehem. So there are two issues. You're going to have a document which says a great deal more than I've already said. You'll excuse my being swift and just going over things briefly, but there are two questions that were rapidly tackled. First of all, the issue of East Jerusalem, and secondly, the issue of refugee camps. East Jerusalem, well, there wasn't a municipal authority there, because East Jerusalem wasn't recognized as such, but nevertheless we thought it was very important that there be a policy there. We discussed this with the representative of the Palestinian Authority in France, and we started a program of action with the authorities there from the year 2000 onwards. Unfortunately, this was dissolved, and therefore this partnership was interrupted. But nevertheless, we continued to work with Palestinian institutions on Jerusalem, because we thought it was very important to have this political willingness there, and to go against this apparent willingness to deny the existence of this area and Palestinians living there. We also have cooperation and work in the cultural and educational domains. Secondly, refugee camps. This is an issue that was tackled. French towns wanted to give their support to these populations in refugee camps, but we didn't want to have an institutional relation first and foremost, because it's not a question of acknowledging the refugee camps, because they're by definition ephemeral, and it's not a case of looking at them directly, but as was said, it's a question of managing the situation. And so certain French groups do have relationships with refugee camps, but that wasn't the main aim of our cooperation. There are also networks and actions carried out in these refugee camps. I will only speak about Ran Khunis, which, in order to cite what Evry has done, Manuel Valls, the mayor there, signed a partnership agreement with the aforementioned camp, and that's important because it shows that French politicians have been involved in this cooperation with Palestine, and they have worked with them as part of their responsibilities, and Bordeaux has also been involved. Just going back over the historical overview, there was a turning point in the years from 2000. We were able to see the turning point after 1996, with the way to which people's mobility was hindered somewhat. In the year 2000, we had the first bases of decentralized cooperation with about 200 elected members, and we saw that the situation was indeed very tense. I personally went there in July 2000, and we saw that the situation on the ground was not tenable, and that is when we had the start of the second intifada, with focus given to our action, because the blockade that we already found in the implementation of our projects sometimes led to the very destruction of the projects which had been implemented. I'm thinking of the Gaza Strip, for example. Action had been taken, but it was then interrupted by the Israeli authorities. We have the network for cooperation, which works in this regard. We started into a period of open conflict there. We had our branch in Ramallah. Of course, we saw the construction of walls there, and we developed our cooperation by focusing more on the political aspect of that cooperation. We had political delegations with a mission to observe the elections there, with more than 10 French politicians for the elections in 2004 and 2005, and we also contributed through a demonstration in Dunkirk in 2003 to launch a network for collective networks in Europe for peace in the Middle East by having networks from Spain, Germany and Italy, and indeed the UK, through what we call the COEPO, which is the Network for European Collectivities for Peace in the Middle East. Just very briefly, some elements on the content of this cooperation. First of all, in 2013, we had 67 active degrees of cooperation, which meant that some cooperation had stopped. We have 67 French groups who have projects in Palestine, and 190 projects in total, 109 partnerships, and 3 million euros has been dispersed, and 5 million more from specific public aid from France for these projects. You can see there the list of some of the projects which have been implemented, which are complementary, which has already been mentioned, I think, today, which focused on the problems seen on the ground. Of course, we have water and sanitation. This is a significant area of cooperation, particularly with regard to the link between Paris and Jericho in the north of the West Bank as well. We also have cooperation with Bethlehem. We can also have concrete aid given to construction, but also to water management systems. For example, we have such a system between Bethlehem and Grenoble. I apologize for going quickly, but we have sports and cultural teams. We have support given to arts and crafts. We have partnerships in terms of tourism. Just linking with what the previous speaker said, I think this is a very important element. Just one thing is that we see the potential for tourism in Palestinian territories. I would just say that Hebron also has very important potential for tourism. So I would just slightly correct what the previous speaker said, just to say that. But nevertheless, we have focused on the town of Hebron at the level of UNESCO. This is a lever which can be very important for a town that has been torn apart by Israeli occupation in the heart of the town today. And this has really hampered the projects which have been deployed. And indeed, Hebron is a fantastic city. I myself have been there. But the work has been hindered somewhat by Israeli occupation because, as you know, since the year 2000, this occupation has expanded. But I think the tourism there is very important, and our networks are working in that area. We have educational action and social action and urban planning. Those are just some of the areas in which we are working. This work is not only in that area, but it's also to strengthen local capacities. Decentralized cooperation is a partnership. It's not replacing local collectivities, but rather helping them in their work. It's a question of focusing on the choices and priorities which our experience can bring, in particular through training in municipal areas. For example, we have exchanges of experience and practices and multilateral seminars. For example, we have fruitful and practical exchanges between France and Palestine. We have elected members from the Maghreb and other areas working with us, with politicians from Palestine. This focuses on areas such as town planning, finances, and human resources, for example. Another element of this is to have the means to fund this cooperation. The means are limited. Some speakers say, well, how many millions of dollars do we have? Well, it's not us providing the millions of dollars, but we can also see how we can help to make sure that bilateral cooperation with France is really focusing on identified projects and projects which have been identified by the work that we have carried out together. Furthermore, we have initial and professional training for the population. This is training in technical areas, health professionals, team leaders, social stakeholders, librarians, hosting interns in specific training. You have this in some detail in the document and also on our website. It also involves university exchange programs organized in the framework of bilateral cooperation. The government is in charge of this, but there is possibility for a multiplier effect to be given to this. We can give out scholarships, for example, which can allow people to become involved with this work. This is an absolutely crucial investment for future cooperation between our two countries. Finally, I would say that there is a lever effect. We're not talking about thousands of people here, but hundreds of people nevertheless have benefited from this relationship. This is also the opportunity for us to bring hospitals, universities, and other bodies on board. And behind this training, it's not only the technical aspect of things, we also look at the better knowledge of the reality on the ground in Palestine. Another very important dimension is the promotion of human exchanges. France has an old practice of what we call twinning between different groups. This started up after the Second World War to foster dialogue between France and Germany, after the fact that our two peoples had been torn apart, and with time these twinnings spread up everywhere, and we moved towards decentralized cooperation, more technical cooperation. But sometimes this neglected the human aspect, but we think it's very important now for this human aspect to be integrated into the planning and to be highlighted. This is all the more important in an area in which technical aspect is hindered by cooperation. We think that decentralized cooperation is also to get rid of prejudices, to foster dialogue between peoples. We know that there are significant prejudices in Europe towards the Arab and Muslim world, and also towards Palestine. And I would say that the work that we have carried out for 20 years, well, I think that now we are able to see the real improvements. I think these human aspects are very important. The same same also goes for our Palestinian friends in order to fight against isolation, blockade, and the misunderstandings that they can have towards the Western world. We can show that in Europe there really are men and women who feel solidarity with the condition of the Palestinian people and also allow some hindrances to mobility to be lifted. We've spoken about this. This also involves red tape at airports, which can hinder the free movement of people. It also involves visa policies in Europe. I think that's important. It's not only a one-way street. It goes both ways, this hindrance on mobility. This is very important. It's a question of doing our bit and to make sure that the Palestinians don't withdraw into themselves. I shall now go very quickly and move on to the next point. We have some examples on other levers. For example, between Bonneuil and Jericho, it's just one example of the cooperation there is. This involves the cooperation at the level of gender between women's organizations and helping children and having sports tournaments. We've had very many activities at the cultural domain, and we've also worked in poetry, photography, cinema. We have experience in Belfort with musical groups, with French young people and Palestinian youths who have worked together and produced CDs and discs. And there has been a group, a partnership between Dunkirk and Gaza, as well as you see, as well as between Toulouse and Ramallah. We have some prestigious cultural activities being carried out there, for example, in schools. I think it's important, therefore, to highlight the major point, which is linked to this cooperation, which involves conquering local opinion and really opinion in general. One of the areas for this cooperation, which we shouldn't forget about as politicians, is that we must have local population on board to international cooperation. It's not always self-evident. International cooperation is sometimes seen as just granting resources to other populations. But in France we also have unemployed people, so we also have problems to resolve. So I think we need to make sure that we can raise awareness about the need for international solidarity to make sure that this is a real lever. But it's also the opportunity for us to raise awareness in France at a local level about the Palestinian cause. Of course, this communication focuses on populations themselves, and we can use the vectors of local communication and regional press and magazines through press communiques, websites, newspaper websites. I think never before as now we have spoken so much about Palestinian cooperation on these medias. We have millions of French people involved in this cooperation, and they're involved in these kind of activities. We have this at a European level. We have begun to work to develop these relations throughout Europe. Just to finish this presentation, you'll excuse me for having been quite terse. We have some important elements finally to highlight. The first thing, of course, I call this a categorical imperative. It is really essential that we focus on this. It's the issue of removing the political obstacles to make sure that the Palestinian people can fully exercise their sovereignty. As I say, there can't be any sustainable development in a political context which has destroyed any initiatives. We can see this in the environmental domain. This involves the problem of settlements and physical hindrances to mobility, and this relates to the cultural domain, as has been said by other speakers, and everything that relates to that. There is sometimes an inability for towns to carry out these kind of programs. Elections are sometimes put back, and there's an inability to build a democratic state which delegitimizes political action itself. We criticize corruption, and we criticize the manipulation by some groups of the Palestinians' opinion, but how can we effectively develop democracy if we don't have the institutions to do so? I personally am struck by the enormous contradiction that we want the Palestinian people to be a model for democracy, and at the same time they're unable to put in place institutions that allow for this democratic structure to function. It's not the word democracy is better than the other systems, as Churchill once said. We need to make sure that we can get rid of this political obstacle. I would say I'm desperately optimistic. I'm desperate because it's a tragic situation, we have to say that, but I'm optimistic because on the ground there is a great deal of energy. I've seen that in Hebron. Mr. Deber also spoke about this at an entrepreneurial level. I am convinced that the Palestinian people are an important vector of development in the entire region, just including beyond Palestine. This is how we saw things in 1994. Even though a lot of damage has been done in the educational sector, there is nevertheless the possibility for us to move forward. There is a diaspora, there is positive resistance, and those involved in this area at a European level are working on this. We also need to put pressure to bear on the international community. After the various initiatives that I've spoken about, we are working as politicians to organize a first forum for decentralized cooperation for Palestine. We will have this meeting, and this will be prepared next November. Finally, I think it's important for you to be aware of this lever of decentralized cooperation, and I would appeal to you to pool your efforts so that we can have a better idea of decentralized cooperation, as well as bilateral and multilateral cooperation. I think it's important that we learn from each other so that we can work jointly to work more efficiently in the future. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butzbach, for that very instructive presentation. I think we can all be optimistic. Thank you also for the details that you have given us about the contribution that the United Cities are giving to solving the problem at a local level. I think that I can say that we can learn a great deal from that presentation, in particular when it comes to thinking globally and acting locally. So thank you once again.